People like you will never stand in front of this courthouse as anything but a criminal." The words tore through the autumn air like a blade, delivered by an officer whose hand slammed against her face as if he could erase her voice with his palm. His spit flew as he barked, veins straining, eyes blazing with the fury of someone convinced he held authority over her very existence. Around them, the marble steps of the United States Federal Courthouse seemed to shudder. Students, tourists, passers-by all froze, phones raised, the silence breaking into gasps and low murmurs. And at the center of that storm stood Maya Robinson, black, female, composed, arms crossed over a white coat that cut through the scene like defiance made visible. She did not blink. She did not bow. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we are glad you are here. Now, back to Maya Robinson. The officer's fingers dug deeper into her cheek, a grotesque theater of dominance. "This ground is for citizens, not for people like you," he hissed, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Another officer to her right tightened his grip on her arm, his knuckles white against the polished wood of her briefcase. "Probably stolen," he muttered, smirking as though humiliation were a sport. The third officer blocked her path, squared shoulders, eyes narrowed, ready to drag her down the steps as if gravity itself could be weaponized against her. The crowd stirred. A woman in a red sweatshirt raised her phone higher, whispering to her friend, "Why are they doing this?" She is not resisting. A man in a suit frowned, shaking his head as he typed furiously into his device, already live-streaming the scene. The courthouse, designed to embody justice, now stood as a backdrop for its betrayal. Maya's silence was heavier than their shouting. It was not absence, it was presence. It spread across the steps, filling the space between every insult, every order. Her lips pressed into a straight line beneath the officer's palm, but her eyes, dark, unflinching, pierced the air. She had heard these words before. At 19, when a security guard at a scholarship gala told her to stand with the staff. At 27, when a hotel manager said, "People like you always try to sneak into penthouses." Each time, the same chorus in different uniforms. And now, again, "You do not belong." But this was not the voice of truth. It was the sound of fear disguised as authority. The officer barked again, louder. "On your knees. Show the crowd what happens when you lie to the law." The command cracked across the steps like a whip. Phones jerked higher, gasps scattered through the crowd. One student muttered, "They are going to regret this." Another voice, trembling but firm, rose from the back. "She has not even said a word." And still, Maya Robinson did not move. She stood anchored to the marble as if the very courthouse rested upon her shoulders. The briefcase in her hand gleamed, its brass lock catching the light like a promise. Inside it was not fraud, not lies, not protest. It was truth, and it was about to explode louder than any siren, heavier than any hand trying to silence her. The scene was no longer just an arrest. It was a reckoning, filmed by dozens, watched by hundreds, destined to be witnessed by millions. And in that moment, though her voice had been stolen by force, her silence roared, "This is not the end of my story. It is the beginning of yours." The marble steps that once felt like the solemn entrance to justice now pulsed with tension. The crowd thickened, a tide of strangers drawn by shouts and flashing phones. Some stood frozen in disbelief. Others whispered furiously, their voices rippling like static across the plaza. She did nothing. A woman in the front row muttered, pressing her phone closer to capture every detail. The accusation of criminal still echoed, not just in the officer's tone, but in the way bystanders looked at one another, as if wrestling with the horror of what they had just heard. Maya Robinson remained unshaken, her arms still crossed, her body rigid with dignity, her silence pressing against the chaos like a counterweight. The officer who had silenced her shifted his stance, perhaps unnerved by her refusal to flinch. He leaned closer, snarling, "Say something now. Defend yourself." His hand fell from her face, but the damage was already done. His colleagues closed in, each grip on her arm firmer, as though the quiet woman before them threatened more than any outburst ever could. In the crowd, a college student whispered, "This is being streamed. Thousands will see this." His friend nudged him, eyes locked on Maya. "Look at her. She is not afraid." Another voice, older and steadier, rose from the back. A retired veteran stood tall, phone in hand, muttering, "I fought for this country, and this is not what justice looks like." But the officers only hardened. "She is trespassing on federal property," one barked, his tone cutting through the noise. Another added, "This woman is carrying fraudulent documents. She does not belong here." They pulled at her briefcase, the brass lock catching the autumn sunlight as it shifted in their grip. The crowd gasped when one officer yanked it roughly, nearly tearing it from her hand. Maya did not resist. She looked past them, up the towering pillars of the courthouse, her eyes fixed as if she could see beyond stone and history to the truth waiting to break through. Her voice finally emerged, low but steady. "This is what fear looks like," she said, each word deliberate. "Not mine, yours." The murmur of the crowd swelled. Phones steadied. A young woman in the front row shouted, "She told you the truth. Listen to her." But the officers pressed harder, their performance now fueled not by justice but by pride, unwilling to release their grip. The steps had transformed. They were no longer just an entryway into a courthouse. They had become an arena where prejudice clashed with poise, where authority tried to crush dignity, and where silence carried more power than handcuffs ever could. And with every second that passed, the audience multiplied, witnesses not only to an arrest but to an unraveling truth that none of them would be able to ignore. The scene on the courthouse steps grew heavier, each second stretching like a taut wire about to snap. The officer gripping Maya Robinson's arm leaned down, his voice sharp enough for the microphones of nearby phones to catch. "You want to look powerful in front of this crowd? Let me remind you, you are nothing here. You are a trespasser, a liar, a fraud." His spit hit the pavement, an exclamation point to his contempt. Maya did not recoil. She lifted her chin slightly, her gaze sliding past him as if his words were no more than dust on the wind. That silence, that refusal to acknowledge the insult, enraged him further. He shoved her shoulder once, hard enough to draw a gasp from the crowd. "Do not act like you are untouchable," he barked. "We decide who enters this court." The audience on the steps shifted. What had begun as curious glances was now a sea of pointed phones, murmurs breaking into open defiance. A woman with a stroller raised her voice, trembling but firm. "She is not fighting you. She is standing still. Why are you treating her like a criminal?" Her words sparked others. A man in a business suit shook his head, muttering, "This is abuse of power, plain and simple." But the officers pushed forward, determined to escalate. One ripped the briefcase from Maya's hand and held it high like evidence. "Fraudulent," he declared. "Property of the state until verified." He smirked as if he had just uncovered contraband, not a woman's personal belongings. The lock glimmered in the sunlight, now a trophy of humiliation. The murmurs turned into gasps. "They stole her property," someone shouted. Another voice from the crowd, "That is theft." The tension shifted visibly. Even strangers who had stood quietly began to step forward, their bodies forming a hesitant line closer to the officers. Through it all, Maya Robinson stood still, arms folded once again across her chest, her presence commanding without volume. She looked at the officer holding her case, then at the crowd behind him. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, measured, and it carried farther than any shout. "You think silence is weakness, but silence is calculation. And when the truth speaks, it will not whisper." The words fell like a stone in water, rippling outward. The crowd reacted with a mix of awe and fury, phones raised higher, whispers rising to chants of disapproval. The steps of the courthouse no longer belonged to the officers. They belonged to the people who watched, to the collective breath held in suspense. And at the heart of it stood Maya, still unshaken, as though she had been preparing for this confrontation her entire life. The air was no longer waiting for justice inside the courthouse walls. It was forming right here, outside, ready to break free. The officer who had seized Maya Robinson's briefcase dangled it in the air, taunting her like a schoolyard bully parading stolen goods. His voice boomed over the murmurs of the crowd. "See this? Proof she is not who she claims to be. Proof that people like her always cheat their way to the front steps." His words cut through the autumn air, heavy with accusation, meant to humiliate her not just in front of the officers, but in front of the hundreds of strangers now watching. Maya's eyes did not leave the briefcase. She stood still, her arms folded tightly across her chest, and the quiet strength in her gaze unsettled him more than resistance ever could. The crowd reacted before she did. A young woman shouted, "That is not proof. That is theft." Her voice cracked, but her courage carried weight. A man beside her joined in louder. "You have no right to take her property." Their defiance sparked ripples of agreement, voices rising one after another. The lead officer sneered at the crowd. "Back off. This is federal business. None of you understand what is happening here." But his words fell flat. The spectators were no longer passive. A college student, phone raised high, called out, "We understand exactly what is happening. We are watching prejudice play out on federal steps." The officer's jaw tightened, his face flushed red. He stepped closer to Maya, his voice dropping to a growl meant for her alone. "You will kneel before this is over. You will be remembered as a liar dragged away in disgrace." His grip on her arm tightened until the leather of his glove squeaked. The crowd gasped again, the tension growing thick, pressing down on every witness. Maya finally moved, slowly, deliberately. She turned her head to meet his eyes. Her voice was calm, but each syllable landed with the force of a gavel. "I do not kneel to fear. I do not kneel to hatred. And I will never kneel to men who mistake cruelty for justice." The steps seemed to shift under the weight of her words. Phones captured every second, the crowd holding its collective breath. An older man near the front, his cane leaning against his leg, said aloud, "That is the voice of someone who belongs here more than any of them." His words drew nods, and a wave of agreement swept through the plaza. The officer holding the briefcase faltered, just slightly, his smirk slipping. He shook the case like a prop, trying to reclaim control, but his hand trembled. Maya's silence and her words had pierced the armor of authority he wore so tightly. The crowd sensed it too. The balance was shifting, even if the officers had not yet realized it. For the first time since the confrontation began, the question was no longer whether Maya Robinson belonged. The question was how much longer the officers could stand in defiance of the truth before the entire nation watching would turn against them. The tension on the courthouse steps had reached a breaking point. What began as a single insult had grown into a spectacle that no one could ignore. Phones hovered in the air like lanterns, catching every angle of the confrontation. The officers seemed to realize the crowd was no longer just a cluster of bystanders. It was an audience, recording their every move, ready to broadcast their actions to the world. One officer barked out, "Disperse! This is an official matter. Move back or you will be detained." But his warning rang hollow. The voices in the crowd rose higher, refusing to be silenced. A college student in the front row shouted, "We are not moving. We are witnessing." His words drew cheers and nods, a collective wall forming between the officers and their claim to unchecked authority. Maya Robinson stood in the center, still anchored, her arms folded across her chest, her gaze steady. Her presence alone was enough to command attention, but it was the silence surrounding her that carried the greatest weight. The air around her felt charged, alive, as if every word spoken against her was being absorbed and transformed into something unbreakable. Then it happened. A young man with a backpack, barely older than 20, stepped forward from the crowd. He held his phone out in front of him, voice trembling but determined. "I am recording this, and the world will see it. You cannot erase what we all just heard. You called her a criminal without cause. You took her property without proof. This is not law. This is discrimination." Gasps and murmurs followed his declaration. A woman nearby lifted her voice, louder and firmer. "He is right. We all heard it. We all saw it. This is wrong." She turned her phone toward her own face, declaring into her live stream, "This is happening at the United States Federal Courthouse. Look at what they are doing to her." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their posture betraying cracks in their authority. One hissed at the young man, "Put that phone down or you will regret it." But the threat did not land. More phones rose, dozens of them, until the steps glittered with tiny screens, all reflecting Maya's calm figure and the officer's heavy hands. Through it all, Maya remained silent. Her refusal to fight back physically only made the officers appear smaller, their aggression amplified against her composure. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the chants and shouts. "You are afraid of the truth. That is why you cover my mouth. That is why you steal what is mine. That is why you raise your voices against silence." The words hung in the air, undeniable. The crowd erupted in applause, a chorus of agreement rolling across the steps. Some shouted her name, others cried out for justice. but all of them stood unified. The courthouse, a building meant to symbolize fairness, had just become the backdrop of its greatest contradiction. And in the middle of it, Maya Robinson stood as the immovable center of gravity, calm as stone, while the weight of injustice began to tilt against those who had tried to bury her dignity under their authority. The courthouse plaza now throbbed with noise. What began as scattered whispers had grown into a storm of voices, every chant echoing against the massive pillars behind Maya Robinson. "This is wrong," people shouted. "Let her go." The sound was no longer just protest, it was testimony. The lead officer tightened his grip on Maya's arm, trying to drag her a step down the marble stairs. "Enough," he roared, his voice strained and desperate. "You are done here. This spectacle ends now." But the crowd did not move back. They moved closer, their bodies closing in like a protective wall. A woman in the front row, her voice trembling but unyielding, shouted, "We are watching you humiliate her in front of the entire nation." She raised her phone higher, her live stream climbing in numbers every second. "Look at her. She is not resisting. She is not violent. And yet this is how justice treats her." Another witness, a young man with a baseball cap, called out, "She gave you no reason. You created the crime just to excuse the punishment." His words landed like a blow. Gasps followed. Then more voices piled on. The crowd now a choir of outrage. The officers grew restless. The one clutching her briefcase held it high as if brandishing victory, his jaw tight, his expression betraying unease. The other officer, still pressing against Maya's shoulder, snapped at the crowd. "She is a fraud. She forged her way here." He pointed at her coat, her calm stance, as though dignity itself were evidence of guilt. But the people no longer believed. They had seen too much. A middle-aged man in a gray suit stepped forward, steadying himself with a cane. His voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through injustice before. "I fought for this country. I know what truth looks like, and it is standing right there." He pointed directly at Maya. The crowd erupted, clapping, shouting, their voices turning into thunder. Maya Robinson remained composed, her arms folded, her gaze unwavering. But then, for the first time, her lips parted. Her words were not shouted, but they cut through the storm with clarity. "You called me a criminal because of how I look. You dragged me because of what I represent. But remember this. The only theft here is what you are stealing from yourselves, the chance to stand on the right side of history." The officer gripping her faltered. His hand twitched, his grip loosening for the briefest second. The crowd roared louder. Phones swayed in the air like proof, each one a silent witness ready to be heard by millions. The courthouse steps no longer belonged to the officers. They belonged to the people watching, recording, remembering. And with every breath, with every word spoken, the ground beneath Maya's feet shifted further away from oppression and closer toward revelation. The lead officer's face reddened, his authority cracking under the weight of so many eyes and so many cameras. He yanked the briefcase higher and shouted for everyone to hear, "This is contraband. This is the property of the state until we verify her identity." His voice echoed against the courthouse pillars, sharp and brittle, as if sheer volume could hide the desperation underneath. The crowd reacted instantly. Boos erupted, joined by shouts of protest. "You stole it!" one man bellowed. "That is her property!" cried a woman clutching her child's hand. Their words rippled outward, carried by the dozens of live streams already spreading across the country. What the officers thought was control had now transformed into evidence of injustice. Another officer, older and clearly more experienced, stepped forward to reinforce his colleague. He puffed out his chest and barked, "Remove her now. This entire incident is trespassing on federal property. If you do not disperse, arrests will follow." His words hung heavy, an ultimatum that felt more like a threat than law. Maya Robinson's eyes narrowed, but she did not move. Her stillness, framed by the chaos around her, only magnified her presence. She spoke, her voice steady, deliberate, each word chosen like a blade. "You can raise your voices, you can wave my briefcase in the air, you can even drag me across these steps. But you cannot erase the truth, and when the truth rises, it will not rise quietly." The reaction was immediate. Applause broke out, spontaneous and uncoordinated, rolling through the crowd like thunder. Some shouted encouragement, others simply wept, their phones trembling in their hands as they realized they were not just recording a confrontation, they were recording history. Frustration boiled in the officers. One leaned close to Maya's ear, his voice low and seething. If you were smart, you would walk away. People like you never win against this system. But Maya turned her head slowly toward him, her eyes unwavering. People like me built this system, she replied softly, her voice like iron wrapped in silk. The crowd erupted again, chants rising louder than the officer's commands. Justice for her, justice for all. The marble steps vibrated with the sound, each shout echoing across the stone as if the building itself were responding. And then came the most shocking act yet. The officer holding her briefcase hurled it onto the ground, the crack of wood on stone jolting everyone into silence. There, he spat. Worthless. Just like her. The hush that followed was deafening. Phones zoomed in, mouths opened in disbelief. Maya Robinson did not look down at the shattered case. She lifted her chin higher, her voice rising above the silence. You did not break me. You only proved me right. At that moment, the courthouse steps no longer resembled an arrest. They had become a courtroom, and every person watching was now part of the jury. The verdict was already forming, and it was not in the officer's favor. The sound of the briefcase hitting the stone still echoed when Maya Robinson finally moved. She bent down, not in defeat, but with calm precision, and lifted the broken case from the ground. Splinters clung to the brass lock, but her grip was steady. She held it against her chest as if it were not just wood and metal, but a symbol of everything they had tried to strip away. The crowd remained hushed, waiting for what she would do next. Dozens of phones caught her every motion, the red recording lights glowing like tiny witnesses. Maya slid her hand into her coat pocket and drew out a slim black phone. She tapped the screen once, and her voice rang out clear. Activate Protocol Justice. Begin full disclosure. On the other end, a woman's voice answered instantly, crisp and controlled. Understood, Miss Robinson. Protocol Justice is live. The system is verifying identities and logging incident data. The entire plaza is now under digital review. The officers froze for a beat, their bluster interrupted by a command they did not understand. The lead officer barked, "What did you just do? Turn that off. You are not allowed to record here." His demand came too late. The giant digital display mounted above the courthouse doors, normally reserved for civic announcements, flickered and came alive. Words scrolled across the screen in bold white letters. Justice audit in progress. Incident logged. Federal courthouse steps. Gasps spread through the crowd. Someone whispered, "She is connected." Another voice shouted, "She has power. Look." The live stream numbers surged higher as viewers across the internet watched the courthouse itself become a canvas for the truth. The officer who had thrown her briefcase stepped forward, trying to snatch the phone from her hand. "Enough games," he snarled. "You are under arrest." But before he could touch her, a chime rang out from the display. The words shifted again. Identity verification. Maya Robinson. Position. Chief Executive Officer, Robinson Global Trust. Status. Verified donor. United States Federal Court Restoration Project. The revelation detonated across the steps like an explosion. The crowd gasped as one. Phones trembled in hands. A teenager shouted, "She is the one who funded this place." An older woman covered her mouth, whispering, "All this time, they were humiliating the very woman who built it back up." The officers' faces drained of color. Their hands loosened around her arms. The one holding her shoulder stumbled back a half step, his authority slipping away with every word glowing above them. Maya remained still, her voice calm but cutting through the shock. "You called me a trespasser at a courthouse I restored. You tried to silence the very woman whose money rebuilt the walls behind you. Now the world knows what you call justice." The crowd erupted. Applause thundered. Cheers rolled down the marble steps. The courthouse plaza no longer felt like a place of humiliation. It had transformed into a stage where truth had just taken center spotlight, and Maya Robinson was no longer the accused. She was the judge. The words on the massive courthouse screen burned brighter than the afternoon sun, each letter cutting deeper into the lie that had been shouted moments earlier. Verified donor, United States Federal Court Restoration Project. The crowd erupted again, their voices carrying the weight of vindication. Strangers shouted her name, some cheering, some simply whispering it like a revelation. The officers stood frozen, their uniforms suddenly less like symbols of authority and more like costumes stripped of meaning. The lead officer, the same man who had silenced her with his hand, stumbled over his words. That cannot be accurate. There must be a mistake in the system." His voice cracked, thin and fragile against the roar of the crowd. Maya Robinson turned toward him slowly, her gaze sharp as a blade. Her voice was calm, yet it carried across the plaza. The only mistake here is yours. You mistook silence for submission. You mistook presence for trespass. And now, you are the one standing in the wrong place. The crowd's energy surged, chants beginning to form. Justice for Maya! Justice for Maya! The rhythm rolled through the steps like thunder, drowning out the feeble protests of the officers. One officer, desperate to reclaim authority, stepped forward with trembling bravado. He raised his voice, pointing at Maya's broken briefcase. That display does not prove anything. Anyone can manipulate a screen. She is still under investigation. His words barely left his mouth before a young woman in the crowd shouted back, "You are lying. We saw you steal from her. We saw you humiliate her. And now the truth is staring you in the face." The digital display chimed again. The text shifted, revealing lines of data, time-stamped logs, and a final entry. Protocol Justice Audit. Officers identified. Badge numbers recorded. Incident under review. Access pending suspension. The crowd gasped as the information scrolled live for everyone to see. A man in a business suit leaned into his live stream camera, saying, "This is real. It is happening in real time. The system is logging everything." The officers' composure shattered. They looked at one another, pale and uncertain, as if the uniforms on their backs had turned to shackles. The one who had shouted the loudest now whispered under his breath, "What have we done?" Maya's presence only grew stronger. She lifted her chin, the fractured briefcase still pressed to her chest like a shield of truth. Her voice carried above the chants, steady and unwavering. "You asked the world to see me as a fraud. Instead, the world is seeing you as thieves of justice, and you will answer for it." Phones shook in hands, not from fear, but from adrenaline. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a reckoning, and everyone present knew they were witnessing history unfold step by step. The courthouse doors loomed behind Maya, taller and heavier than ever, yet it was no longer the building that held power. It was her, and the officers who once thought themselves gatekeepers now stood exposed as trespassers in the very place they had tried to claim. The courthouse plaza had transformed into a living tribunal. The chants shook the air, rolling through the stone steps, echoing off the marble pillars like a drumbeat of justice. Cameras were everywhere now, thousands of eyes from across the world pouring in through live streams, each one amplifying the downfall of men who thought their uniforms could shield them from accountability. The lead officer's hands trembled at his sides. His badge, once a symbol of power, now felt like a target. He muttered under his breath, "Shut it down. Shut it all down." But his words carried no force, no command. His subordinates shifted nervously, their eyes darting to the glowing display above the courthouse doors. The screen pulsed again, revealing a chilling line of text. "Federal oversight activated. Badge access under suspension review. Disciplinary action pending." The crowd erupted in gasps and cheers. A teenager at the front shouted into his phone, "It is happening right now. The system is shutting them down." His voice cracked with disbelief, but the stream of comments flying across his screen confirmed it. People were watching in real time, and they were not looking away. The officer who had hurled Maya's briefcase onto the stone steps tried to speak, but his words faltered. This is some kind of trick." His eyes betrayed him, wide with fear, his bravado collapsing in front of hundreds. "No system can just erase us." Maya Robinson stepped forward at last, her movements slow, deliberate, like the striking of a gavel. The fractured briefcase remained in her grasp, but it was no longer the focus. She was. Her voice cut clean through the chaos. "You thought authority was permanent. You thought cruelty would go unanswered. But authority is earned, and cruelty is documented. And now the record speaks louder than your voices ever could." A woman in the crowd shouted, "Tell them who you are." Phones swiveled to capture her face, waiting. The chants softened, the air pulling taut with anticipation. Maya's eyes moved across the sea of witnesses. She spoke, not loudly, but with a force that commanded silence. "I am Maya Robinson, Chief Executive Officer of Robinson Global Trust. I am the principal donor who restored this courthouse. The very building you stand in front of exists because I rebuilt it." The words detonated. Gasps became roars. Cheers shook the steps like an earthquake. Some wept openly. Others raised fists in solidarity. The officers looked paralyzed, their faces pale, their bodies shrinking under the weight of revelation. The digital display confirmed it with a final declaration. Identity verified. Status principal donor. Federal Access Authority confirmed. The ground seemed to shift beneath the officers' boots. The crowd pressed closer, no longer simply recording, but surrounding Maya like witnesses protecting their own judge. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the officers had nothing to say. Their voices had abandoned them, while hers filled the entire plaza. The courthouse plaza thundered with applause and outrage, a storm of voices now fully turned against the officers. The chants were relentless. "Justice for Maya! Justice for Maya!" The sound rattled the very glass doors behind her, proof that the people had chosen their side. The lead officer, sweat dripping down his temple, tried to salvage his crumbling authority. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Enough of this! This does not change protocol. She is still under arrest until—" He stopped mid-sentence. His radio crackled at his belt, a sharp tone cutting him off. A metallic voice came through, cold and merciless. "Officer conduct breach detected. Immediate suspension enforced. Badge access revoked." The officer froze. He yanked his badge from his chest, staring in horror as its small red light blinked, then turned black. The others followed, their own badges buzzing faintly before going dark. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others laughing in disbelief. Phones zoomed in, capturing the moment their power vanished before the eyes of the nation. Maya Robinson stepped forward, closing the space between herself and the men who had tried to humiliate her. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You thought you could strip me of dignity. Instead, you have stripped yourselves of authority." Her gaze locked on the lead officer, her eyes unwavering. "You are finished." At that moment, her phone chimed again. A voice came through, clear and authoritative. "Miss Robinson, all 3 officers have been logged out of the federal system. Their employment has been terminated effective immediately. Legal proceedings are now in motion." The words were devastating, not because they were shouted, but because they were final. The officers staggered back, their faces pale, their bodies slack with disbelief. One whispered, "This cannot be happening." Another muttered, "We were only following." But his words trailed off into silence, drowned out by the cheers of the crowd. A young woman near the front wept openly, her phone shaking in her hand. "They tried to erase you," she cried, "but you erased their lies instead." A man in a gray suit spoke firmly into his live stream. "I have lived in this city for 40 years. I have never seen justice delivered so swiftly." Maya lifted her chin, the fractured briefcase still cradled in her arm like a relic of battle. "This is not revenge," she said, her voice resonant. "This is accountability. This is what happens when silence meets truth, and truth refuses to bow." The steps of the courthouse, once the stage for her humiliation, had become the courtroom of her triumph, and the officers who had called her a criminal now stood as defendants in the trial of public conscience, stripped not only of their badges but of their false authority. The verdict was clear. Justice had spoken, and Maya Robinson was the one who delivered it. The crowd on the courthouse steps was no longer restless. It was alive, electric, united. What began as whispers of disbelief had swelled into a chorus of vindication. Strangers clasped each other's shoulders, tears streamed down faces, and the chants of "Justice for Maya" rolled like thunder against the federal pillars that had once been silent witnesses. The 3 officers stood hollow, their badges lifeless, their authority erased in full view of the public. They looked like men stripped bare, no longer enforcers of law, but examples of what happens when prejudice masquerades as power. Phones captured every twitch of their hands, every flicker of shame across their faces. They were no longer feared. They were judged. Maya Robinson stood at the center of it all, her posture unbroken, her gaze lifted toward the crowd that had become her jury. The fractured briefcase rested against her side, no longer a symbol of humiliation, but of survival and revelation. She stepped forward, each movement deliberate, her heels striking the marble like the closing notes of a verdict. She raised her voice for all to hear, steady and commanding. "They called me a trespasser at the courthouse I rebuilt. They called me a fraud while holding my property in their hands. They tried to cover my mouth because they feared my voice. But today, the truth has spoken, and the truth cannot be silenced." Applause broke out, wild and uncontrollable. Some raised fists, others raised phones, all of them united by the moment. The courthouse plaza had transformed into a living testament to dignity, proof that silence could be stronger than shouting, proof that injustice could be unmasked without violence, only with resolve. Maya took a breath, her eyes sweeping across the sea of faces. She continued, her tone softer but no less powerful. I did not need to film this moment. I did not need to beg for fairness, because I am not the evidence of injustice. I am the result of overcoming it. Remember this day, not because of what they tried to take, but because of what they could not touch. They could not touch my dignity, they could not touch my truth, and they could not touch the justice that belongs to all of us. The crowd erupted again, their cheers rolling like waves across the stone steps. Some chanted her name, others simply stood in silence, absorbing the weight of her words. For many, it was more than a moment. It was a mirror reflecting their own experiences, their own battles against walls built from prejudice. The officers were escorted away, powerless and silent, swallowed by the same system they had once wielded like a weapon. The cameras followed them, but the story no longer belonged to them. It belonged to Maya Robinson, who had stood still and turned humiliation into history. As the cheers echoed, Maya closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them with renewed clarity. She looked directly into one of the cameras streaming live and delivered her final words. I do not need to record proof. I am the proof. And today, justice is not inside these walls. It is right here. The plaza roared. The courthouse loomed behind her, and Maya Robinson walked up the steps not as a victim, but as the embodiment of justice fulfilled.